So Advent begins today. Not Christmas, but Advent, the 4-week journey that we take towards Christmas. So whereas many parts of the world tell us that Christmas is already upon us, we just hold on and wait just a little bit longer as the church and say, actually, it's Advent. We bring our candles. Part of our tradition here at Westside is every week we light a different candle representing the 4 weeks of hope, love, joy, and peace of Advent. Because Advent is the journey to Christmas. It's the journey of waiting. Advent means the coming and the arrival. And so the kind of Christian calendar says that we have these 4 weekends of Advent. And then Christmas starts on the 25th of December. And it runs for 12 days until Epiphany starts after that. So it's not that the church is saying, let's have less celebration time. It's actually that it's saying, let's wait and then have more celebration time, because Christmas is a 12-day event. And children, I believe that means you're allowed to ask for 12 presents for every day. That seems legitimate, and the pastor said it, so that will help your family harmony. But this is a time for us to think a little bit about this story of Christmas, this story that we see happen in Christmas. And in one sense, you say, well, why do we tell the same story every year? Well, a couple of reasons. One is I'm not yet convinced there's a better story, but also because by retelling a familiar story, we find unfamiliar things in that journey. And when you hear a story again, perhaps you see something you'd never saw before. Maybe it's like watching back your favorite movie and you see something that was always there, but somehow all of the previous watchings you haven't noticed it. Well, maybe it's the same for you this Christmas, that something jumps out to you in the story that's new for you. Or perhaps you have changed. Perhaps your year has been different. Perhaps 2019 did some things to you that were unexpected, or perhaps just changed you. And now you come back to this story and you see things that were always there, but they mean different things to us. So across this series, as we tell the story of what's going on, and that begins in this place called Bethlehem, I want to curate various ideas that perhaps I've extracted from it that I hope will help us on our journey. Perhaps this might be sort of notions and ideas about the depths of this particular story, or the wisdom that the story gives to us, the values that the story kind of brings to our lives. Sometimes I think when you read the Christmas story, you just see its contrasts. You see how the story that it's trying to tell and the lives that we live are so often different. Because we have this strange moment that happens in Bethlehem. This child is born. It's a gift from God, we say. So often when we're talking about gifts, particularly in the Bible, we realize what we're actually talking about is grace. The Bible so often uses the same word to talk about both things, that somehow a grace has been given to us. A baby is placed in a manger, and these biblical writers say, well, the story of the world has changed somehow. The story of the world is now different somehow. And so we honor this every year. This story of a gift of God, and we honor it by a huge moment of desire and greed and narcissism and debt. Didn't we do well? And then, of course, having said all those things, we add to the list guilt. Because we all end up feeling a little bit bad at Christmas time. Every year after Christmas in January, the credit card statement comes in and you decide 2019 is going to be different. 2019, I'm not going to spend so much. Let's not do presents this year, we say in January, as we're driving away from the sales. We find ourselves thinking this year we'll do it a little bit differently. But every year Christmas comes back around and we seem to get drawn into the materialism of it. We find ourselves kind of caught up in the sort of, in the lights and the splendor and the deals in the stores, and we say, let's do it all over again. Retail stores tell us that 50% of their income for the year happens at Christmas. So our malls are surviving because of Christmas. Because we go there and we hit it hard. A survey just done about last Christmas in Canada said that the average Canadian budgeted $675 for gifts last Christmas. $675 per Canadian for gifts. Fascinatingly, by the way, on the people surveyed, what the kind of breakdown of those gifts, 15% of that was gifts for themselves. Aren't we a kind lot? 64% of the people in the survey said that they don't save for Christmas. They just deal with Christmas when it happens. And in fact, actually, half of the people responded to say that not only did they not save for Christmas, but we actually don't plan for Christmas either. So Christmas becomes arrive at the mall and see what the mall tells me I should buy. 7 out of 10 people, in fact, actually, let's go back for a second. $675 per person, but I snuck a little word in there, budgeted per person. Because 7 in 10 Canadians say that actually when it comes to Christmas, they go over budget. They spend more than they intend to, and 60% of the people said that they were willing to go in debt in order to put gifts under a tree. But the profile of us is quite fascinating as well. Interestingly, they surveyed across 3 different sort of generations to see sort of what the expenditure patterns look like. How do millennials spend at Christmas? How do Gen Xers spend at Christmas? How do boomers spend at Christmas? And I know you all think you know how this goes, but actually it seems that the older you are, the more likely you are to go over budget at Christmas time. To which the boomers say, those tight millennials, I knew we'd outspend them. Interestingly as well, they discovered that if a person responded to say that they considered themselves an emotionally stable person, the likelihood of them going over budget in their Christmas shopping went up. People that responded to say that perhaps they struggle with nervousness or anxiety or depression spend less, or rather don't spend less, but are less likely to go over budget. And interestingly, the more you consider yourself creative, the less likely you are to spend more at Christmas. So emotional stability works against you when you're trying to save money. That's just one for the teenagers in the room to help with their parents. The interesting thing is that whenever you ask anybody, not just, and this was seen in the survey that was done in Canada, but whenever you ask just people that you're maybe at work with, most of us seem to be aware of the fact that we overspend at Christmas. We just seem to know that. We all talk about it. We're aware of it. It's like, yeah, I overspent again. So what happens then is we end up feeling bad. We go into this Christmas season, which we're all really excited about. The net result is we end up feeling bad at the end of it. But we say it's because Christmas is so commercialized, because there's so much like appeal to us, and constantly we're being sold stuff, and constantly we're being dragged into this sort of way. And wouldn't it be so much better, we say, if Christmas was less commercial, like when we were kids? And everybody seems to be saying this. Everybody has this mindset that when they were kids, Christmas was like, your mom gave you an orange and a lump of coal and said, Jesus loves you, and you were just content because it were simpler times back then. And we talk about this childhood that we had, but pick up a black and white movie. And what you realize that before they could even put color onto film, Christmas was commercialized. Pick up one of the old Christmas movies that you watch as a family and say, this is what Christmas movies are supposed to be like from back when Christmas was less commercialized. And what you realize is in 1940s Christmas, it was commercialized then. It was when you were a kid, and it was when your parents were a kid. Because actually it seems that we can trace the commercialization of Christmas back to Victorian England. So let's blame them. Prior to Victorian England, Christmas was exclusively celebrated amongst rich people. Poor people didn't have the time, they weren't afforded the space, they didn't have the benefits. So the idea of a kind of time of celebration just wasn't really on the agenda. Actually, if you think about the Christmas Carol by Dickens, you'll sort of get that sense that Christmas isn't kind of thought about in the same way as we do now. And then in the midst of Victorian England, the decision was, let's actually push Christmas a little bit more. Let's actually advertise Christmas in a kind of commercial way. And the reason that was done was so that Christmas could be opened up for everyone. So the commercialization of Christmas was a process done in Victorian England to ensure everybody got to celebrate. Which kind of makes me feel bad for wandering down through the mall, kind of grumping at everybody for the commercialization, because maybe at the start it was a good idea. But the point for me really is that the nostalgia that we often find in our hearts at Christmas time towards when it was simpler or when it was less the way it is now is often more a nostalgia of our mind than a nostalgia of facts. So how do we respond to this? What do we do as Christians? How are you supposed to, as any person, how are you supposed to relate to Christmas? Some of my friends have done this thing where they give their kids 4 gifts at Christmas time. So a gift that they want, a gift that they need, a gift that they can wear, which nobody wants, and a gift that they can read. I assume it was Dr. Seuss that came up with this strategy due to the brilliant rhyming of it all. But gifts that you want, gifts that you need, gifts that you wear, gifts that you read. And then other people have said, no, that's still too much. 3 gifts is the amount you should share with your kids for Christmas. Jesus got 3 gifts, and it's good enough for him. It's good enough for you. Kids are getting a little nervous at this point in the service. And they're going, I really don't like where this sermon is going. And what are we trying to do with 4 gifts? And what are we trying to do with 3 gifts? Generally, what I find is that there's a kind of underlying narrative, particularly amongst people that follow Jesus, of saying what we're trying to do at Christmas is get away from the materialism and get into something spiritual. If we can find some spiritual depth to Christmas, then that will make Christmas right again. But just is that the right question to ask? Is that the thing we should be thinking as Christians? Just before we jump onto the bandwagon and turn to our kids and say, no presents for Christmas, you're just going to pray, let's hold up and turn to the Bible. Isaiah chapter 9. For me, this passage is one of those passages, whenever I hear it, I feel like Christmas. Right? This is the passage that, like when we're at the Advent service on Wednesday evening, I turned to Tori and said, now it feels like Christmas because now we're reading Isaiah chapter 9. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. You could teach a whole series on this passage alone, but I want to stay on point this morning. This wonderful counselor, this mighty God, this everlasting Father, this Prince of wholeness. Remember the Hebrew behind that word peace is shalom. Shalom is much bigger than just no war. Shalom is about completeness. It's about wholeness. It's about everything being right. And I want a beautiful message of Christmas there, that actually what we're waiting for in Advent is a God who will come and put all things back together again. So when you sit and feel the brokenness and the fragmentedness and just that sense that life isn't right, the promise of Christmas isn't just wholeness for a moment, but wholeness forever. Perhaps you've had one of those moments, I don't know, it'd be different for everybody. Maybe for you it's on the side of a ski hill, or maybe it's on the beach with your family, or maybe it's, I don't know where it is, maybe it's sat around a dinner table with everybody there. You know, you get those moments in life where you go, this is perfect. And you want to snap that moment and you want to hold it forever and you want to say this moment, but the reason you want to hold on to it is because you know the moment's going to go and your life's going to carry on, and that moment of feeling and just perfectness is just not going to be there. And the promise of Advent, that what's coming at Christmas, is that wholeness and perfection would be forever. So Christmas draws the deepest yearnings of our hearts out of us and offers us not just simply peace, but completeness. But he offers us this because a child is born and a son is given. I think we're trained to read this passage spiritually. There's often a sense, if you've been in church for a while, or if you've been exposed to Christianity for a while, there's a sense in which Christianity's always talking about spiritual stuff. And so therefore, we read a passage like this, and we say, well, okay, what's the spiritual lesson for us here? How's this going to help me understand my spiritual life? But this text is about a child being born. Now, I know that some of you are going to say, well, that's a deeply spiritual moment. But I want to suggest it's actually a profoundly material moment. A child being born is about flesh and blood and breath and water and all of these things coming together. There's one thing you don't do if you're ever present at a child being born, is saying, just the most transcendent spiritual experience of my life. You go, no, this was real. There's blood, guts, and poop, And for to us a child is born, the text says. It's not a spiritual moment this text is speaking about. It's a material moment. And sometimes as a church, we're running to get away from the material and forget that the story of Christmas is known as an incarnation story. The language that the church has used for years, to be incarnate, to be made flesh. We're telling the story about God becoming material. We're telling the story about God becoming flesh and blood and moving and living amongst us. This isn't an exclusively spiritual story. In fact, it's a story about physical things, that God would put on skin and be amongst us. So Advent then isn't the journey away from materialism. Actually, it's a journey towards it. Advent says you need a God who's touchable. You need a God who's feelable. You need a God who's physical and amongst us. And Advent offers us a hope of Emmanuel, God with us. This God is coming, and he's a material gift. A writer that helped me think a lot about this and correct me, because this sermon has a little bit of a repentance in it for myself, because this hasn't often been the way that I've found myself thinking about Christmas. But Jason McKelly says this: if Jesus is God with us, then giving material gifts of love that highlight our withness, our connection to someone we love, really is the most theologically cogent way of marking Christ's birth. So let me just bring all of the kids back on board with me for a moment here. So there was that really tense point in the sermon where it sounded like I was saying 4 gifts. And then there was that even more tense bit where I said, maybe only 3 gifts. Now what we're saying, and this is your dinner time conversation with your mom and dad or whoever today, is now what we're saying is giving gifts makes us like Jesus. Okay? So let's just hold that if that's your only takeaway from the sermon. If Jesus is God with us, then the giving of gifts highlights our witness with other people. Listen, I think it's really easy, and let me just speak as a Christian, I think it's really easy to be a little bit humbug at Christmas. A little bit like, it's Christmas. And listen, I'm probably the worst of people like that. So I go to the mall with my spiritual superiority, and I wander around, and I'm going to look at all these pagans spending all their money on, Westsiders. And I kind of get there, and I kind of, if I'm honest, like my journey has often, I grew up in a pretty poor background. I lived in a different culture, in Western Africa, and Christmas was really, really simple, and therefore the kind of glitz of Western Christmas, I'll be honest, I've always struggled with. And I think it's perfectly okay that I've always struggled with that. The problem is, I've tried to spiritualize my struggle with it. I've not, rather than just owning the fact that it's just not what I grew up with, so it feels a little bit weird, what I've tried to do is say, well, it's because I really get Christmas, and I'm really on board with what Jesus is doing. I'm just not. That's why you won't get a present from me this year. But what I'm realizing is actually that's just been some coating I've put on something else that might be real and might be valid, but let's not try and spiritualize that, because here's the thing. By attempting to be more spiritual, invariably we Christians, or we the church, end up sounding more like Judas than we sound like Jesus. Remember Judas, Jesus' disciple, who looked after the money. And Judas held the money tighter than a Scotsman and was always frustrated at any expenditure that was going on and didn't want that spent. And so often when we're talking about Christmas, the church sounds like that because we're criticizing the gift giving and we're criticizing the expenditure. And we say it's because we want to be more spiritual, but maybe it's just because we're tight. Maybe it's just because we're grumpy. Maybe it's just because we've forgotten grace. Okay, like for sure. Okay, let me just be clear for a second here. Spending money you don't have is a bad idea. Okay, I have a kind of 1-sentence finance course, which I'm happy to share with you. Don't buy things you can't afford. Okay, that's the entire course. I'll mail you the certificate afterwards. But so don't go into debt over Christmas time, right? And stop buying junk. Okay, we all have enough socks. All right, so nobody ever felt loved by the purchase of socks. And so like we don't need to do all of that sort of stuff, but stop thinking that somehow it's more spiritual not to be generous, that somehow it's more spiritual not to give gifts. Because is Christmas a time where God gave us Jesus and therefore we should not be generous at all? Or is Christmas a time in which we say, because of the greatest gift humans could ever imagine, what you're going to notice in us is that our already generous lives are going to become more generous as we try to model what it looks like to be the people that received the gift that God sent to us? Because you see, the gift was grace. And grace doesn't come based on worth, and grace doesn't come based on what you've done, and grace doesn't come based on what you've achieved. It's just given to you. And what happens to us sometimes, I think, if we're not careful, is we start bemoaning expenditure. And that's when we start to sound a little bit like Jesus. So look at all this money. Think of what we could spend that money on. And that might be a valid criticism, but here's the warning. Sometimes when we bemoan expenditure, it's a very short step to start bemoaning generosity. And then it's a very short step from there to start bemoaning grace. And we find ourselves then at the heart of the problem. And there are things we need to spend wisely. We need to be careful of our money. You know that, and it's a different sermon for a different day. But let's not pretend that our frugality is based on spirituality when sometimes it's just because we don't really want to accept that God has poured out this incredible grace on us. That's not what Christmas is trying to remind us of. Hey, we're Christians. We want to tell you this amazing story about a God who gifted us his son. And you can spot how much he's changed our lives because you don't see us buying presents for anybody. You know, like how does that pass on what it is that apparently is in us? In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1, John writes to this church and he says, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are." Somewhere in this story, we have to wrestle with the fact that our God has lavished gifts upon us, that he has poured out his son into flesh and blood for us. And therefore, we need to think about how we respond to that. And it's hard to know how to respond to that because so often Christmas is about guilt, and Christmas is about rules, and Christmas is about achievements. You've probably encountered this already. It could be in a variety of ways. That it constantly feels like we're falling short at Christmas time. Am I spending enough? Am I showing off enough? Am I doing the right things that I'm supposed to do to be in the right places? And Christmas can get, if you head to the mall with that attitude that I've somehow got to keep up, Christmas will become about guilt, and Christmas will become about falling short. And of course, the irony of that is Christmas is about this God child born amongst us to tell us that nobody needs to fall short ever again. To tell us that God doesn't count in the way that we count, that you don't need to achieve his particular standard, that you don't need to achieve a particular level. That's all a way of thinking that the Bible calls law, but we could just call rules or achievement-based culture. The gospel comes and says to us, what if there was a God who just wants to lavish gifts upon you? And so what the law does really cleverly, and what Christmas then does if we're not careful, is it actually becomes quite introspective. We start to think about ourselves all the time. And Christmas can really push that into hyperdrive. What am I doing for me, or what am I doing for the people who are closest to me? Maybe a question to ask yourself is, can you think of any area in your life at the moment, as you come into Christmas, that the sense of needing to achieve or find comparison just gets a little raised up? You know, maybe it's the kids come home from school and are told that this is what everybody else's parents is buying their child for Christmas, and you're failing miserably as a parent because you're not buying this. Or maybe it's because next door has a Santa with a full row of reindeers and you've just got a Santa on your roof and therefore you're falling short. Or maybe your turkey's not as good as your neighbor's turkey. Or maybe you've never quite figured out how to have the party that your parents have. If we're not careful, the gifts, the spending, the lights, the money, it all starts to pile up on us, and it makes us feel like we're just not good enough. And then we turn up at church and the pastor says, worse than that, it's a spiritual holiday and you're getting so distracted by all of this sort of stuff. And we find ourselves just feeling bad the whole time, which is deeply ironic if you think about what this story is supposed to be about. It's about the gift of God. It's about a God who gives us gifts. So how do we learn to model that in gift giving and not in guilt and self-centeredness? What does it look like for us to live out the story of Christmas? What does it look like for us to spread this message of the gospel? That God got materialistic at Christmas time. That God put flesh and skin on and lavished on us. So don't go out and overspend and say the pastor told me to. Don't buy junk because now you're allowed to buy gifts. Don't operate in guilt because that's not going to get you anywhere. But maybe a gift is the most theological thing you could do this Christmas. Maybe a gift is the most spiritual thing. Maybe the gift for the person that doesn't expect it. Maybe a gift for the person that can't give it back to you. Maybe just pour out gifts on your kids because you love them and it's within budget, so it's going to be okay. Maybe share what it is that's somehow an expression of what it is that God has put in your hearts. No matter who we are, no matter what our finances are, we can respond to God's grace and gift to us. And I don't think the way to respond is by kind of becoming sort of shut up in our own little Scrooge type world and saying, this is how we properly respect Jesus. Because Advent is the story of a gift that came near. And we should tell that story well. We should tell that story with words and with our generosity. Because those of us who understand that God has given us the greatest gift, I think we should be the best gift givers in the world. So here's my prayer for you this Christmas. May you be free from guilt this Christmas. There's always going to be somebody spends more, has bigger lights and fancier turkey. But may you be free from guilt this Christmas. May you not make this Christmas about you, but may you make it about living out the generosity of God in simple, creative, exciting ways that represent what it is that God has put in you.